Welcome to Go Reading Bedtime Stories, presented by GoReadling.com, personalized education and reading skills for kids. Find a comfortable spot, close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let our story carry you gently off to sleep. Tonight's story is called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Once upon a time, in a kingdom high in the mountains, where the snow capped the peaks like white hats, and the valleys were green and full of flowers, a beautiful queen sat by a window sewing. The window frame was made of dark ebony wood, and outside, soft white snowflakes drifted down from the sky. As she sewed, the queen pricked her finger, and 3 small drops of red blood fell onto the fresh, white snow on the windowsill. The queen looked at the 3 colors together, the red blood, the white snow, and the black ebony, and she made a gentle wish. "I wish for a child," she whispered, "with lips as red as blood, skin as white as snow, and hair as black as ebony." And in time, her wish came true. A baby girl was born, and she was everything the queen had wished for, beautiful and full of life. They named her Snow White. But sadly, the good queen became ill and passed away, and the little princess grew up without knowing her kind, gentle mother. The king, Snow White's father, married again. His new wife was beautiful to look at, but her beauty was only on the outside. Inside, she was cold, proud, and terribly vain. She spent hours and hours gazing at herself in a magic mirror that hung on her chamber wall. This was no ordinary mirror. It could speak, and it always told the truth. Every morning the queen would stand before it and ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" And every morning the mirror would answer, "You, my queen, are the fairest one of all." This answer made the queen smile with satisfaction. She believed she was the most important person in the kingdom, and as long as the mirror confirmed it, she was content. Meanwhile, little Snow White grew up in the castle, kind and good, playing in the gardens, singing to the birds, and making friends with everyone she met, from the stable boy to the kitchen cook. She did not care about being beautiful, she only cared about being kind. Snow White grew up in the castle like a wildflower that had taken root in a garden of stone. She made friends with everyone, the kitchen maids who slipped her warm biscuits when no one was looking, the stable boys who let her brush the horses, the old gardener who taught her the names of every flower that grew within the castle walls. She had a special fondness for animals. Bluebirds would land on her windowsill each morning, and she would scatter breadcrumbs for them. A family of rabbits lived in a burrow beside the rose garden, and Snow White would sit quietly nearby, holding perfectly still, until the baby rabbits grew brave enough to hop right up to her and nibble clover from her outstretched hand. She loved to sing, and her voice was clear and sweet, like a bell ringing across the mountaintops. When she sang in the courtyard, the servants would stop their work to listen, and even the grumpy old castle cat would uncurl himself and purr. The queen heard Snow White singing too, and it made her frown, for the child's natural beauty and goodness reminded her of everything she pretended to be but was not. As the years went by, the queen became more and more obsessed with her magic mirror. She would spend entire afternoons in her chamber, asking the same question over and over, never quite satisfied with the answer, even when the mirror confirmed she was the fairest. She began to study dark spells in secret, mixing potions to keep her skin smooth and her hair glossy. She ate bitter herbs and bathed in strange concoctions by candlelight. The servants whispered about the odd smells that drifted from under her door. But the queen did not care what anyone thought. All she cared about was being the most beautiful. She never visited Snow White, never asked about her lessons or her drawings. She never tucked her in at night or read her a story. Snow White did not mind, for she had the warmth of the kitchen hearth, the company of the animals, and the great, wide, beautiful world outside the castle windows. She would sit by her bedroom window at night, looking out at the mountains and the stars, and she would think, somewhere out there, beyond those peaks, there must be so much more to see. And she would close her eyes and dream of meadows and forests and cottages nestled in quiet valleys. Years passed, and Snow White grew from a little girl into a lovely young woman. She had lips as red as a rose, skin as fair as fresh snow, and long dark hair that shone in the sunlight. One morning, the proud queen stood before her magic mirror as usual and asked her daily question, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" But this time, the mirror gave a different answer. "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen's face went pale, then red with fury. She could not bear the thought that someone, anyone, was more beautiful than her. From that moment, jealousy and hatred grew in her heart like a poisonous weed. She could not look at Snow White without feeling a burning anger. And so she began to plot a terrible plan. The queen summoned her huntsman, a quiet, strong man who spent his days in the forest. She gave him a terrible command. "Take Snow White deep into the woods," she said, her voice cold as ice. "Leave her there, far from any path, so she can never find her way back." The huntsman was horrified, for Snow White was kind and gentle and had never harmed anyone. But the queen's eyes were fierce, and he was afraid to refuse. The next morning, he told Snow White they were going on a walk to pick wildflowers in the forest. Snow White happily agreed. She loved the forest, the tall trees, the soft carpet of moss, and the little streams that bubbled over smooth stones. They walked deeper and deeper into the woods until the trees grew so thick that only thin beams of sunlight could find their way through. Finally, the huntsman stopped. His face was full of sorrow.
"Princess," the huntsman said, his voice shaking, "I was ordered to leave you here. The queen is jealous and wishes you gone. I cannot do this terrible thing, but I also cannot take you back. You must run, Snow White. Run deep into the forest and find a safe place to hide. Do not come back to the castle." Snow White's eyes filled with tears, but she could see the pain in the huntsman's face and understood that he was trying to help her. "Thank you," she whispered. She turned and ran into the forest, not knowing where she was going, just running. Branches scratched her arms, roots tripped her feet. The forest grew darker and deeper. She ran until her legs ached and her breath came in ragged gasps. Finally, completely exhausted, she collapsed beside a mossy log and cried. She was lost, alone, and far from everything she had ever known. The forest was quiet around her. A deer watched from between the trees, and a small rabbit hopped closer, twitching its nose curiously. When Snow White had cried all her tears, she wiped her eyes and looked around. The forest was not as frightening as it had seemed while she was running. The sunlight filtered through the leaves in warm, golden patches. A stream rippled nearby, clear and fresh. Bluebirds sang in the branches above her.
She stood up, took a deep breath, and began to walk along the stream. The water would lead somewhere. After a long while, as the afternoon light turned soft and amber, she came to a small clearing, and there, nestled among the trees, was the most charming little cottage she had ever seen. It had a tiny door, tiny windows with flower boxes, and a tiny chimney from which no smoke came. Everything about it was small and neat. She knocked softly on the door. No one answered. She tried the handle, and the door opened with a gentle creak. She peeked inside. Inside the cottage, Snow White found a tiny kitchen with a tiny table set with 7 tiny plates, 7 tiny cups, and 7 tiny spoons. There were 7 tiny chairs around the table, and upstairs she found 7 tiny beds all in a row, each covered with a little patchwork quilt. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. The dishes were dirty, the floor was unswept, and cobwebs hung in every corner. "Whoever lives here could use some help," Snow White said to herself. Because she was kind by nature and not the sort to sit idle, she began to tidy up. She swept the floors and dusted the shelves. She washed the 7 tiny plates and cups until they sparkled. She wiped down the little table and straightened the quilts on each tiny bed. She found some vegetables in the kitchen and made a big pot of warm soup, enough for everyone. Then, feeling very tired from her long, frightening day, she lay across several of the tiny beds and fell fast asleep. When evening came, the owners of the cottage returned home. They were 7 dwarfs who worked deep in the mountains, mining for gold and silver and precious gems. They were short and sturdy, with long beards, kind faces, and colorful pointed caps. When they opened their door and saw their clean, tidy home, they were astonished. "Who swept the floor?" said one, scratching his head. "Who washed my plate?" said another, examining his cup. "Who made this lovely soup?" said a third, sniffing the air hungrily. They crept upstairs and found Snow White, sound asleep. "Goodness!" whispered the eldest dwarf. "A girl in our house!" They gathered around, whispering among themselves, until one of them accidentally bumped a chair, and Snow White opened her eyes. She sat up, startled, and saw 7 kind, round faces looking at her with curiosity and concern. "Please do not be afraid," the eldest said gently. "You are safe here. Tell us, who are you, and how did you come to be in our little house?" Snow White explored every corner of the little cottage with growing delight. In the tiny pantry, she found jars of honey and dried herbs, small sacks of flour and oats, and strings of dried mushrooms hanging from the ceiling. There was a cellar door that led to a cool underground room stocked with apples, carrots, and turnips. Whoever lived here worked hard, but clearly had not had the time or perhaps the energy to keep things tidy. Snow White hummed softly to herself as she worked, sweeping corners, polishing the little copper kettle, and arranging the dried herbs in meat bundles. She opened the shutters wide and let the fresh forest air pour in. Sunlight filled the cottage, and dust motes danced in the golden beams. She picked wildflowers from the clearing outside, purple asters and white daisies, and tiny blue forget-me-nots, and placed them in a small clay jug on the kitchen table. The cottage was transformed. It went from dusty and neglected to bright and welcoming, and it smelled of warm soup and fresh flowers. A squirrel peeked in through the open window, twitching its bushy tail, and Snow White laughed. "Come in if you like," she said. "There is plenty of room." As the afternoon light turned golden and then amber, Snow White began to feel the exhaustion of her long, terrifying day settling into her bones. She had run through the dark forest, cried until she had no more tears, and then spent hours cleaning and cooking. Her arms ached and her eyelids grew heavy. She climbed the narrow staircase to the bedroom and looked at the 7 little beds again. Each one had a name carved into the headboard in tiny letters, names she could not quite read in the fading light. She lay down across the last 3 beds, which were just big enough together to fit her, and pulled a soft patchwork quilt over her shoulders. Through the small window above the beds, she could see a rectangle of sky turning from peach to violet. One bright star appeared, then another. The forest outside was settling into its evening quiet, the birds growing still, the crickets beginning their gentle song. Snow White thought of the castle, so far away now, and of the good huntsman who had saved her life. She whispered a quiet thank you into the darkening room, and then her eyes closed and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Snow White told them her story about the jealous queen, the huntsman's warning, and her terrifying run through the forest. The dwarfs listened with serious faces, nodding and murmuring sympathetically. When she finished, the eldest dwarf spoke. "You are welcome to stay with us as long as you need," he said firmly. "We are simple folk, but our home is warm, and we have plenty of food. No one will find you here." Snow White was so grateful that fresh tears rolled down her cheeks, though this time they were tears of relief and happiness. "Thank you," she said. "I will help with the cooking and cleaning and anything else you need." And so Snow White began her new life in the little cottage in the forest. She cooked meals for the dwarves, mended their clothes, tended a small garden, and kept the house tidy. In return, the dwarves were her protectors and her friends. They told her stories of the gems they found deep in the mountains, stones that glowed blue in the dark, crystals that sang when the wind blew through them. Every evening they would sit around the fire, and one of them would play a little flute while the others hummed along. The days passed peacefully. Snow White felt safe and happy in a little cottage. She made friends with the forest animals, a family of squirrels, a gentle old doe, and a robin who would sit on her windowsill every morning and chirp a greeting. But far away in the castle, the queen still had her magic mirror, and one morning she asked it her question. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?" The mirror answered, "Beyond the mountains, in a house so small, Snow White is still the fairest one of all." The queen's face turned white with shock, then dark with rage. Snow White was alive. The huntsman had tricked her. She paced her room, seething with fury, and began to plan a new and more terrible scheme. This time, she would deal with Snow White herself. The queen went to a secret room in the deepest part of the castle, a room full of dusty bottles, strange herbs, and flickering candles. She was skilled in the dark arts, and she brewed a terrible poison. She chose a beautiful apple, the most perfect rosy red apple you ever saw, and she dipped one half of it in the poison. The poisoned half looked as beautiful and delicious as the other. Then she disguised herself as a stooped old woman, wrapping herself in a gray shawl with a hood that hid her face. She put the apple in a basket with other harmless fruit and set off through the forest. She knew the way to the dwarf's cottage, for the mirror had shown her. She walked for a long time through the dark trees, bent over her basket, muttering to herself. "One bite," she whispered, "just one bite, and Snow White will sleep forever." Each of the 7 dwarfs had his own personality, and Snow White grew to love them all. The eldest was wise and thoughtful, always the one to settle disagreements with a calm word. The second was jolly and round, with a laugh that shook his whole body and made everyone else laugh too. The third was shy and quiet, preferring to sit in the corner with a piece of wood he was carving into tiny animal figurines. The fourth was perpetually sleepy, nodding off at dinner and having to be gently nudged awake by the others. The fifth was the busiest, always fussing about keeping things organized, counting the silverware and straightening the quilts. The sixth was cheerful and optimistic, greeting every morning with a bright, "What a wonderful day," regardless of the weather. And the seventh, the youngest, was clever and curious, always asking questions. Why is the sky blue? Why do mushrooms grow in circles? How deep does the mind go? Snow White answered as many questions as she could and admitted when she did not know, promising they would find out together. The dwarfs had never had anyone take such care of them, and they had never taken such care of anyone. It was, for all of them, the family they had always quietly wished for. The seasons turned gently in the forest. Spring brought a carpet of bluebells to the clearing around the cottage and filled the air with birdsong. Summer was warm and long, and Snow White would pack lunches for the dwarfs to take to the mine, wrapping cheese sandwiches and apple slices in cloth bundles. In autumn, they gathered mushrooms and hazelnuts, and Snow White learned to make preserves from the wild berries that grew along the forest paths. Winter wrapped the forest in a thick blanket of snow, and the little cottage glowed like a lantern in the white landscape, its chimney puffing warmth into the frosty air. On winter evenings, they would huddle around the fire, and the eldest dwarf would tell long, winding stories about the early days of the mine, about the time they found a sapphire as big as a hen's egg, or the underground river that sang when the wind blew through the tunnels above. Snow White would make hot cocoa from the milk the shy dwarf's goat provided, and they would sip it slowly, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of snow falling outside the windows. Those were perhaps the most peaceful, contented evenings of Snow White's life. When the queen arrived at the cottage, the dwarfs were away at their 9. Snow White was alone, sitting in the garden, feeding breadcrumbs to the robin. The old woman hobbled up to the gate. "Good morning, dearie," she croaked in a sweet, harmless voice. "Would you like a beautiful apple? I have too many, and they are so fresh and ripe." Snow White looked at the apple. It was the most beautiful apple she had ever seen, red and round and gleaming in the sunlight. The dwarfs had warned her never to open the door to strangers, and she hesitated. "I should not take anything from someone I do not know," she said politely. But the old woman persisted. "Look, I will take a bite myself to show you it is safe." She bit into the unpoisoned half and chewed with a smile. "See, perfectly delicious." Snow White, trusting the old woman's kindness, took the apple and bit into the poisoned half. The moment the apple touched her lips, Snow White's eyes closed, and she fell gently to the ground, as if she had simply decided to take a nap among the flowers. She did not move, she did not breathe noticeably. She lay perfectly still, as if in the deepest, most peaceful sleep imaginable. The old woman cackled and hobbled away into the forest, her disguise falling away as she went. When the 7 dwarfs came home that evening, they found Snow White lying in the garden. They tried everything to wake her, calling her name, gently shaking her shoulders, bringing cool water from the stream. But nothing worked. The eldest dwarf picked up the fallen apple and understood immediately what had happened. "The queen," he said sadly. "This is her doing." The dwarfs were heartbroken. They could not bear to put Snow White in the cold ground. Instead, they made a beautiful bed of crystal and glass and laid her on it, surrounded by wildflowers. They placed it in a clearing in the forest where the sunlight always shone warmly.
The dwarfs kept watch over Snow White day and night. Seasons changed. The leaves turned gold and red, then fell. Snow covered the clearing in a soft white blanket. Spring returned, and new flowers pushed up through the earth. The forest animals came to sit by Snow White's crystal resting place: the deer, the squirrels, the robin. She looked as if she were simply dreaming, her cheeks still touched with color, a gentle expression on her face. The dwarves never lost hope. They believed, somehow, that she would wake up. And one bright spring morning, a young prince came riding through the forest. He had been traveling for many days, exploring the wild mountains and valleys beyond his own kingdom. He followed a narrow path through the trees and came upon the clearing. The prince saw Snow White lying on her bed of crystal, surrounded by flowers, bathed in golden sunlight. He was struck by how peaceful she looked, and by a deep, unmistakable feeling that he had known her his whole life, though they had never met. The dwarves told him her story. The prince was moved. He knelt beside her and gently brushed a strand of dark hair from her face. "She does not deserve this," he said softly. "May I sit with her for a while?" The dwarves nodded. The prince sat beside Snow White and talked to her as if she could hear him. He told her about his travels, the sunsets he had seen over the sea, the kind people he had met in distant villages. He told her she was brave, braver than he could imagine. And then, without thinking, he leaned forward and placed a gentle, respectful kiss on her forehead. "Please wake up," he whispered. And then something wonderful happened. Snow White took a breath, a real deep breath that filled her lungs with the sweet forest air. Her eyelids fluttered. She opened her eyes and saw the blue sky above her, the trees swaying gently, the faces of her 7 dear friends looking down at her with tears of joy streaming into their beards, and a young man she had never seen before, smiling at her with the kindest eyes she had ever known. "Where am I?" she murmured. "You are safe," the prince said gently. "You are home." The dwarves cheered and danced and hugged each other. The forest animals gathered around. The squirrels chattered, the robin sang its brightest song, and the deer nuzzled Snow White's hand. She was alive, she was awake, and she was surrounded by love. The days that followed Snow White's awakening were filled with quiet joy. She was weak at first, and the dwarfs fussed over her endlessly, bringing her warm broth, extra blankets, and armfuls of wildflowers until her small room looked like a garden. The shy dwarf carved her a delicate wooden bird, and the sleepy dwarf, who had stayed awake through many long nights keeping watch, finally allowed himself a well-deserved nap that lasted an entire day. The prince visited every afternoon, bringing news from his kingdom and stories from his travels. He and Snow White walked slowly through the forest, relearning the paths together, watching the deer graze in the meadows and the fish leap in the streams. Snow White breathed the forest air deeply, tasting its sweetness, grateful for every breath. She looked at the world with new eyes, noticing how the light fell through the leaves in patterns of gold, how the moss felt soft as velvet underfoot, how the birdsong rose and fell like a gentle conversation. Everything seemed more vivid, more precious, more beautiful than she remembered. She never wanted to take a single moment for granted again. One evening, as the sun was setting and the sky was streaked with rose and lavender, Snow White walked to the clearing where she had lain sleeping for so long. The crystal bed was still there, though the dwarves had covered it with moss and ivy, turning it into a garden bench where butterflies now rested. Snow White sat on it and looked around. The forest was peaceful. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. She could hear the distant sound of the dwarves singing as they walked home from the mine, their voices rising in a cheerful chorus that echoed through the trees. She thought about everything that had happened: the jealous queen, the dark forest, the kindness of strangers who became family, the long sleep, and the awakening. She realized that every fearful moment had led her to this place of love and belonging. Without the queen's cruelty, she would never have found the dwarves. Without the long sleep,
she would never have met the prince. The hardest parts of her story had led to the most beautiful ones. She smiled and stood up as the dwarves appeared at the edge of the clearing, waving and calling her name. She ran to meet them. Snow White and the prince walked together through the forest, talking and laughing, and they discovered that they were kindred spirits, both kind, both curious, both lovers of the natural world. Snow White returned to the dwarf's cottage, where a great celebration was held. The dwarfs cooked the biggest feast they had ever made. There were 7 kinds of soup, 7 kinds of bread, and 7 berry pies. The prince stayed on, and over many peaceful days, he and Snow White became the dearest of friends. As for the wicked queen, when she stood before her mirror and asked her question one last time, the mirror looked at her coldly and said nothing at all. It simply went dark and never spoke again, for the queen's cruelty had emptied her of all beauty, inside and out. Snow White never returned to the castle. She found that the little cottage in the forest, surrounded by the dwarfs, the animals, and the mountains, was the truest home she had ever known. The prince visited often, and in time he and Snow White were married in a simple ceremony in the clearing where she had once lain sleeping, with wildflowers in her hair and the 7 dwarfs standing proudly beside her. They lived gently and happily, always kind to those who needed kindness, always grateful for the friendship that had saved them. And on quiet evenings, when the fireflies danced and the stars came out, Snow White would sit by the window and think of her mother's wish, long ago, in the falling snow, and she would smile. The night settled softly over the forest, and everything was peaceful. Good night, dear child. Close your eyes and dream sweet dreams. And that is the end of our story. Thank you for listening to GoReadling Bedtime Stories. Visit GoReadling.com for more stories, reading adventures, and fun learning for kids. Sweet dreams, little one. Good night.